I never liked driving that stretch after midnight. There was something about the way the two-lane blacktop unspooled through the flat American farmland, flanked by empty fields and sagging wire fences, that made every shadow feel like it had weight, every bend like a memory trying to slip past you in the dark. Maybe it was just the silence, how it seemed to press against the car windows, thick and insistent, until even the low rumble of the engine sounded out of place. Or maybe it was just the nature of the job. Being a funeral driver means carrying what no one wants to carry, and most nights I'd gotten used to being alone with the dead, humming along to static, letting the highway eat the miles between small towns where grief was always a private thing. That night was supposed to be routine, a simple run. Pick up in Dyer, drop off in Everton, 30 miles on roads so familiar I could have mapped them with my eyes closed. The deceased was an older man, no family at the scene, just a name on the release form and a note that the funeral would be closed casket. It was a job for someone who asked no questions, who didn't mind silence, who wouldn't be spooked by the occasional bump from the back or the odd sigh of shifting wood. That was me, or so I told myself as I signed the forms and eased the hearse back onto the highway, the weight of the casket already blending into the hush that always seemed to settle over the car once the trip began. Halfway out of Dyer, the road narrowed and the houses vanished, replaced by broken-down mailboxes and soy fields blanketed in mist. My only company was the halo of yellow thrown by the headlights, illuminating little more than the next 100 feet, and the silver veins of rain threading down the windshield. It was cold for spring, the sort of cold that made every surface slick, every breath visible, and my hands ached from gripping the wheel for so long. I kept the radio off and tried not to think about how far I still had to go, how little there was to keep me anchored in the world of the living. That's when I saw the headlights ahead, impossibly bright and low, cresting a gentle rise in the road about half a mile ahead. My first instinct was relief. A rare late traveler, maybe a milk truck or another long-haul driver, the only other soul awake for miles. But as the lights drew closer, I felt my skin prickle. The shape of the vehicle was too familiar, the proportions unmistakable, long, broad, and squared off at the corners. Not just another car, but a hearse, and not just any hearse, but one that looked exactly like mine. The same dull gray paint, the same bug-splattered chrome, the same squat roof and long, angular body that had ferried hundreds of people to their resting place. At first, I thought it had to be a trick of the light, a reflection, maybe my own headlights bouncing off a road sign or some piece of farm equipment. But the other car kept coming, steady and purposeful, hugging the shoulder like it knew every inch of the pavement. As it approached, I slowed, then slowed again, heart suddenly hammering for no reason I could explain. We were the only two vehicles on the road, twin processions headed toward each other in the dead of night, our cargo silent, our destinations fixed. The other hearse flashed its brights. Reflexively, I reached for my own, and as the beams crossed, I saw the outline of the other driver for the first time. My chest tightened. He sat the same way I did, one hand at 12 o'clock, elbow out the window even in the cold, hat pulled low, the outline of his face nearly lost in shadow. But there was something else, something eerily familiar, in the way he gripped the wheel, the tilt of his chin, the slump of his shoulders. I could have sworn it was me, down to the shape of the jaw and the way the tie sat a little askew, just like mine always did. I blinked hard, feeling a jolt of fear that was deeper than any logical explanation. The other driver's eyes caught the light for a split second, and I felt the world lurch. I moved to the right, giving him space. The other hearse mirrored the action, drifting to his right as if on the same invisible string. The road narrowed to a bottleneck around a patch of old construction, and suddenly there wasn't enough room for both of us. We slowed together, both cars easing to a crawl, headlights throwing monstrous shadows across the muddy shoulder. For a moment, neither of us moved, both locked in the same odd dance of caution and inevitability. Then I edged forward, and so did he, until the hoods nearly touched. We were bumper to bumper, two identical cars, two identical drivers, caught in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a dead man and our own reflections for company. I reached up and rubbed my eyes, willing the image to dissolve. When I looked again, the other hearse was gone, simply vanished, as if swallowed whole by the fog. My pulse thundered in my ears. I twisted around in my seat, half expecting to see the other car in my rear view, but there was nothing, just the receding beam of my own taillights, painting the empty road in ghostly red. I sat there for a long minute, heart pounding, breath fogging the glass, not daring to move or even breathe. When I finally started the car rolling again, my hands shook on the wheel. I told myself it was exhaustion, the product of too many sleepless nights and too much time alone with the dead. But when I reached Everton, I couldn't remember the last 5 miles of road. My watch had stopped at 2:13 a.m., exactly the time I'd met the other hearse. I checked the logs, checked my paperwork, checked the back seat for anything out of place, but found only silence and the lingering icy feeling that I'd crossed a threshold I didn't understand. That night when I tried to sleep, I dreamed of long roads and headlight beams sweeping endlessly over empty fields, and always, another car just like mine, approaching from the other direction, driven by someone whose face I could almost see but never quite recognize until finally I did. And deep in the back of my mind, something told me this was only the beginning. The road would call me again, and next time I might not be able to pass by. Next time I might have to stop and ask myself what I was really doing out there in the dark, and what I was carrying besides the dead. By the time the next service came up a week later, I had half convinced myself the night on the rural road was nothing but exhaustion and nerves. Maybe I'd imagined the other hearse in the fog. Maybe it was the play of headlights on a wet windshield, or some trick of memory the mind plays when it's been too long since you've heard another human voice. That's what I told myself as I left the city behind. The long, straight stretches of farmland peeling away under the wheels, the blacktop glistening with last night's rain. But as I drew closer to the same bend in the road, my hands started to tense on the steering wheel, and every mile felt heavier, as if the silence was waiting to fill itself with something I couldn't name. It was a Tuesday this time, an ordinary night with nothing in the air but the distant hum of crickets and the endless static of the radio. The sky was overcast, a low grey ceiling that pressed the darkness closer to the ground. I watched for deer, for farm trucks, for the random burst of headlights that signaled company on these forgotten stretches, but nothing came. The minutes blurred together until I found myself rounding the same curve where I'd met the other hearse before. That's when the headlights appeared ahead, dim at first, then rising, gleaming white and unblinking as the shape of a car drew into view. My breath caught. The other vehicle was a hearse again, same model, same dull metallic finish, and as we drew closer, it matched my speed precisely. I slowed, so did it. I edged left, and it edged left. The movement wasn't just parallel, it was delayed, like a reflection in an old mirror just a split second behind. My mind raced, logic struggling against a cold, crawling sense of déjà vu. The road was wide enough for us to pass easily, yet as we met at the narrowest section, both cars slowed, then stopped completely, hoods almost touching. The silence was so complete that the ticking of my watch sounded thunderous. But then I realized the watch had stopped, its second hand frozen at 2:13 a.m., again, exactly the moment we'd crossed paths last time. I stared into the opposite windshield, trying to see the driver. The glass was fogged, but I caught a glimpse, a shape hunched over the wheel, hat pulled low, face a pale oval with features so familiar they made my blood run cold. I raised my hand, half in greeting, half in fear, and the figure did the same, just a beat after me. I blinked, and suddenly it felt as if I was looking in a time-warped mirror. My movements echoed, slightly off, not simultaneous, but not separate either. I tapped the horn, more to reassure myself that I was awake than to signal the other driver. The sound hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Then, without warning, both vehicles jerked forward at the same instant, noses nearly touching before the other hearse veered away into the mist. I slammed on the brakes, skidding sideways, heart hammering as I whipped my head around to catch sight of the other car. But there was nothing. No taillights, no engine noise, just the quiet and the breathless dark, as if the encounter had been erased from the road the moment it ended. For a long minute, I sat in the intersection, staring back the way I'd come, feeling the fine hairs on my arms stand straight as I realized the air in the car had turned icy. The silence inside felt charged, electric, like it was pressing secrets into my bones. When I finally gathered myself enough to drive on, I noticed that the clock on the dashboard had started again, but the radio refused to tune in to any station but static. I found myself glancing at the rear-view mirror over and over, half expecting to see another pair of headlights come barreling up behind me, or worse, to find someone sitting in the back seat, my own reflection, older, wearier, eyes full of knowledge I was not ready to bear. When I reached my destination, I checked the car from end to end but found nothing amiss. The cargo was undisturbed. The paperwork was in order. Only my own hands shook as I signed off the delivery and stepped out into the pre-dawn air, feeling for all the world as if I'd carried something more than a body across those empty miles. I didn't sleep at all that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw myself staring back from the driver's seat of another hearse, on a road that seemed to loop back on itself, never quite ending, never quite letting me leave the question behind. Who was driving whom, and which of us had the right to claim the night as his own? But even then I knew that I would take that road again. I had to. Because once you've seen your own face in the headlights of a car that shouldn't exist, you can never really stop looking for it in every mirror, every window, every shadow that stretches out just a little too long in the lonely dark. After that second night, I spent every hour behind the wheel dreading the moment when the road would lead me back to that same haunted stretch of blacktop. I tried to reason with myself, to imagine that I was overtired, or that my nerves were fraying from the constant demands of the job, but deep down, I knew there was something more, something in the marrow of the journey itself, as if the road had become aware of me and was reaching out, calling me back again and again to face whatever waited in the midnight hush. The funeral home gave me routes at random, some local, some distant, but no matter how carefully I planned my detours, or how earnestly I tried to convince myself that it was all just chance, I always found myself drawn back to that endless, winding country lane. The next time it happened, it was a Friday, a night choked with low clouds and a mist that seemed to gather in pools on the pavement, blurring every landmark and making the trees along the roadside loom like silent witnesses. My cargo was a young woman, barely more than a girl, lost to the river in the thaw of spring. The hearse felt heavier than usual, the rearview mirror framed by the outline of her casket, its smooth, lacquered surface barely catching the faint light that crept in from the highway. I drove with the window cracked, hoping the cold air would keep me alert. But as the miles unspooled behind me and the map grew irrelevant, I realized I was right back where it had started. The same intersection, the same stand of willows shivering in the breeze, the same feeling of being watched by something I couldn't see. This time the other hearse was already there, idling on the shoulder, headlights pointed directly at me, twin beams of cold blue-white slicing through the mist. As I drew closer, the driver's silhouette became clear, more distinct than ever, every detail sharper, as if I was looking at a photograph taken in a place I'd once called home. The figure wore the same suit and tie, the same gloves, the same worn hat, but now I could see more. A wristwatch identical to mine gleaming on his arm, and on his cheek, a thin scar I remembered getting when I was 16, a mark that only those closest to me had ever noticed. I slowed to a stop, the hearse rolling to a gentle halt as the other driver did the same, our cars facing each other like adversaries in some silent duel, the windows fogged with our breath. But as I wiped mine clear, I saw the other driver's hand move in perfect unison, trailing a finger along the glass just as I did. My throat tightened. The world felt paper thin, stretched between us, as if we were two halves of the same moment, caught in a loop that would never let either of us go. We sat like that for what felt like hours, engines murmuring, headlights flickering in the mist until, finally, the other driver gave a slow nod, a gesture so familiar it sent a cold shiver down my spine. I nodded back, unable to help myself, and for the briefest instant I saw something in his eyes, a glint of recognition or maybe warning, something that made me wonder if he was waiting for me to understand what I already feared. I shifted in my seat, my hands trembling on the wheel, and the other driver mirrored me, moving with the same weary resignation. Without thinking, I reached for the dashboard, glancing down to check the clock. It had stopped again, this time at 1:47 a.m. A new minute carved into the ritual, a sign that the story was deepening, that whatever was happening was not just a haunting, but a message meant for me alone. When I looked up again, the other hearse was gone, vanished into the fog as if it had never been there at all. But the feeling of being doubled, of seeing myself reflected in a moment that didn't belong to any world I knew, stayed with me. Over the following weeks, every trip through that stretch of road brought another encounter, each one slightly different but always unmistakable. Sometimes I saw the other hearse waiting. Sometimes it would appear behind me in the rear view, headlights growing larger and larger until I thought they would consume me. Each time the details grew sharper, a ring I'd inherited from my father, the way I drummed my fingers on the wheel when I was anxious, the threadbare patch on my coat's left sleeve. Each time I recognized more of myself in the other driver, until it felt as though I was watching my own life play out from a distance, helpless to intervene. And always the encounter ended the same way. The two cars face to face, the world silent except for the steady thrum of engines and the racing of my heart. And then, with a shudder, the other vehicle would vanish, leaving me alone with the memory and the growing certainty that something was building, drawing me closer to a truth I was afraid to face. As the days turned to nights and the weeks began to blur, I found myself waiting for the next meeting, caught in a pattern that grew tighter, more claustrophobic, with every circuit of the road. I started to keep a journal, recording every detail I could remember, the time, the weather, what I saw, what I felt. But no matter how carefully I documented the encounters, the entries all began to run together, as if the story was being written by someone else's hand. The only constant was the feeling that, with each repetition, I was moving closer to the heart of the mystery, to the moment when I would finally have to look myself in the eye and answer the question that had begun to haunt my every waking hour. Who is driving the other car, and what will I see in his face when the road runs out? But even as the fear mounted, so did the curiosity. Each repetition brought new details, small clues that hinted at a pattern, a reason for the doubling, for the endless circling of the same haunted mile. I told myself that if I could just understand, if I could just survive one more encounter, I would find the way out. But deep down I knew the truth. Some roads once taken never let you leave, and this was one of them. It was the next sequence of nights that unraveled any remaining skepticism I clung to. The encounters had become routine, and yet the terror only deepened, growing quieter, more insidious, a constant crawling presence in my bones. I could sense it during daylight, in the ache of my knuckles, or the way my thoughts slowed when I looked at the road map, every route inexorably bending back to the same place. But it was the signs, small, inexplicable, yet impossible to ignore, that truly began to convince me this was more than exhaustion or fear. It started with the clocks, the one on my dashboard, the cheap wristwatch I wore, a battered Timex that had survived a decade of night shifts and spilt coffee, even the ancient wall clock in the prep room at the funeral home. Each one would, at some point, inexplicably stop ticking at the exact moment I'd last seen the other hearse. Sometimes 2:13, sometimes 1:47, sometimes a different hour altogether, but always the moment of crossing, the point when the world seemed to pause, breathless. Once, at home, I woke in the dead of night to find the bedside alarm frozen at 2:01, the digital numbers glowing coldly in the dark. For several nights, I left my phone recording on the seat beside me, and when I reviewed the audio, I would hear a faint static, an undercurrent of whispers, like a crowd gathering at the edge of a funeral procession, just at the moment when the two hearses would meet. But that was only the beginning. I began to dream night after night of crashing metal and screaming tires and broken glass littering the shoulder of the rural road. In every dream, the headlights of another hearse bore down on me with blinding intensity, and I would see myself behind the other wheel, sometimes older, sometimes younger, always with eyes that pleaded for something I couldn't name. I'd wake drenched in sweat, the taste of blood and gasoline sharp on my tongue, heart racing as though I'd barely escaped some terrible judgment. And always, as I sat up in the dark, I'd hear the faint echo of a horn, long and mournful, fading into silence. One morning, after a restless night, I climbed into the hearse to find a note tucked under the sun visor, a scrap of delivery paperwork from years ago. The ink faded, but the name still legible, my own. I had no memory of writing it, no explanation for how it had appeared, but there it was in my own careful hand, dated on the same day as my last encounter on the rural road. Shaken, I threw it away, but the next night another note appeared, this time a page torn from an old maintenance log, with a single line scrawled across the middle. Look behind you. I nearly veered off the road that night, my eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, expecting at any moment to see the other me driving close behind, waiting for the chance to overtake me for good. Even the living began to notice the change. My supervisor at the funeral home asked if I was feeling all right, said I looked pale, like I'd seen a ghost or had one riding along in the back. My mother called me at odd hours, saying she'd had dreams of funerals, that she'd woken in tears with the sensation of having lost me, even though we hadn't spoken for days. My friends drifted away, unable to understand why I jumped at every shadow, why I'd grown so withdrawn, so obsessed with the route that led always back to the same lonely crossroads. The encounters themselves shifted too. Sometimes the other hearse would slow, rolling alongside me for what felt like miles, headlights flickering like dying stars. Sometimes it would hang back, its presence a constant pressure on my mind, forcing me to watch for it in every puddle, every reflective surface, every passing window. Once, during a thunderstorm, both cars stopped together at the edge of a flooded field, and for a split second the lightning illuminated both windshields, and I saw, staring back at me, my own eyes full of fear and a plea for understanding. There were messages too, carved into the condensation on the windows, written in dust on the dashboard, scrawled across the back of a business card I didn't remember carrying. "Turn around. Don't go. This isn't your funeral." They grew more frequent, more urgent, until I could hardly distinguish between what I had written and what the other me had left behind. It became clear in those weeks of signs and portents that this was not simply a haunting, not a ghost story to be told over drinks or laughed off at the end of a shift. I was being warned, by myself, by fate, by the road itself. The story was no longer about who I was carrying or where I was taking them. It was about me, about the collision waiting for me in the dark, the accident already written in the lines of my palms and the ticks of a stopped watch. And yet, even as the evidence mounted and the fear grew, I could not keep myself from returning. Each sign, every broken clock, every whispered dream, every note and warning only convinced me more that I had to see this through. Something waited for me on that road, and I would not, could not, look away, even if I knew somewhere deep inside that the next meeting might be the last. I became desperate to change my fate, to wrestle back even the illusion of control from this invisible force that steered me night after night into the teeth of my own reflection. At first I tried the simplest thing, refusing the rural route entirely, mapping out new directions with obsessive care, plotting every funeral and delivery to skirt around the haunted stretch. I asked dispatch for different assignments, invented excuses about construction and roadblocks, traded shifts with colleagues when I could. Sometimes it worked for a few nights, and I would find myself ferrying the dead through city streets humming with neon and life, beneath the glow of lamplight and the distant hiss of traffic. For a moment, it almost seemed as if I'd slipped the noose, escaped the gravity of that looping rural mile. But even as I felt a thread of hope, the world bent to its old pattern. A GPS glitch would reroute me at the last minute, citing a phantom road closure. An accident would snarl the main highway, pushing me back to the country lane. Once, after an especially long detour, I realized, too late, that I'd somehow circled back to the same intersection, headlights shining on the familiar rusting road sign, the wind whistling with the lonely music of fields and distant coyotes. The air in the car would grow heavier, colder, the steering wheel stiff in my hands as if something waited for me to give in and complete the cycle. And every time I found myself again on that cursed stretch, the encounter would repeat, more intense and more inevitable than before. Sometimes the other hearse would appear in the distance, headlights small and far, giving me the illusion of time to turn away, to backtrack or floor the gas. But the road would twist and narrow, hedging me in, and when I tried to turn around, the car behind became the car ahead, or the road itself folded back, dissolving landmarks into a fog of memory and dread. Once, in a fit of panic, I left the hearse by the roadside and set out on foot through a muddy field, boots sinking into the cold earth as rain lashed my face. I walked for hours, yet every path brought me back to the car, its engine idling in the darkness, windows gleaming with condensation, my own face reflected in the glass, older and more desperate with each pass. The funeral home staff began to whisper. My supervisor pulled me aside, concern in his voice. "You sure you're all right? You look like you haven't slept in days." My hands trembled as I insisted everything was fine, but he wasn't fooled. "You know, they say some drivers get attached to a route, haunted by it." He meant it as a joke, but the words gnawed at me, feeding the secret conviction that something more than routine was at play. Out of options, I turned to ritual. I left offerings, coins, flowers, a scrap of ribbon from an old funeral bouquet, at the crossroads where the encounters always began. I recited prayers, both the ones I'd learned at my grandmother's knee and desperate ones of my own invention, begging whatever force lay beneath the surface of the road to let me go. I tried driving with the rearview mirror covered, with the radio blaring, with the windows wide open, cold air numbing my skin until I could barely feel the wheel beneath my fingers. Nothing helped. The other car appeared regardless, unwavering, always mirroring my every move, the other driver's face shifting between a mask of pity and a rictus of warning. The cycle grew tighter. I would lose time, whole hours swallowed by the repetition. I would wake from half-sleep to find myself already driving, headlights carving through the mist, the familiar dread blooming in my chest. The watch on my wrist would freeze. The radio would spit static or replay the same song over and over. An old country waltz, slow and plaintive, its melody looping as if sound itself had been trapped on that road with me. The worst were the nights I tried to turn back. No matter how many times I reversed course, the road would twist, unspooling beneath me in endless grey ribbons, until at last I would find myself back at the intersection, headlights blazing into the eyes of my twin, my double, myself. The fear and exhaustion became my constant companions, and every failed attempt only deepened my certainty that there was no escape, that I was being shepherded toward a destination I could neither see nor comprehend. Through it all, the funerals continued, the cargo changed, the days bled into nights, but the ritual of the drive remained. I began to sense a pattern, a purpose to the repetitions, as if I was being prepared for a final encounter, for a truth I had thus far refused to face. And in the silence between each failed attempt, a new determination grew. If I could not break the cycle, perhaps I could understand it. Perhaps I could confront the ghost in the glass, and at last discover whether it was warning me away from death or simply leading me home. It was after another failed escape, in the hush that follows the resignation of inevitability, that the boundaries between the two cars and the two drivers grew dangerously thin. The encounter that night happened beneath a moonless sky, with clouds swollen low and heavy, and the air so still it was as if the world had stopped breathing. I was too tired to be afraid, my mind dulled by repetition and the weight of all my unanswered questions, and so, when the other hearse appeared around a curve and slowed to match my speed, I found myself strangely calm, almost expectant. We drifted along, the two vehicles side by side, wheels humming in perfect sync, and I saw my own face in the opposite window, my own movements echoed half a heartbeat later. There was no mistaking it now, the same chin, the tired eyes, the same line of worry etched across the brow. Yet there was something different in his gaze, something sharper, more knowing. The silence between us grew thick, heavy with the anticipation of words neither of us wanted to say. Then, with a sick twist in my gut, I realized the windows were sliding down, mine first, then his, glass grinding slowly into the door as if the cars themselves willed this contact. The night air was cold and wet, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and turned earth. And then I heard it, a voice my own but older, hollower, as if filtered through years of regret and sleeplessness. "How many times?" it asked quietly, barely more than a whisper. "How many times will you drive this road before you understand?" I tried to answer, but the words caught in my throat, replaced by 1,000 memories of funerals driven in rain and snow, of names and faces that blurred with time. The other me continued, his tone gentle but relentless. "You're not just a passenger in this story. You've always been the driver. You chose the shortcut. You ignored the signs. You closed your eyes every time the headlights turned to bone." I flinched at the phrase, not sure if I'd ever said it or only thought it, but the other's lips twisted in a smile that was not unkind. He told me secrets I had buried in myself, memories I never spoke aloud, of the night I nearly fell asleep at the wheel after a double shift, the guilt I felt for every family I couldn't comfort, the loneliness that crept into the empty seats behind me after every funeral. He recited lines from dreams I'd half forgotten, of distant voices calling my name in the fog, of a collision always just beyond the next bend. "You know what waits at the end," he said, and in his voice was the soft ache of mourning, the acceptance of a fate that could not be dodged. "Why do you keep returning?" he asked, his face half lit by the dashboard glow. "What is it you still hope to change?" For a moment the cars slowed, engines nearly stalling and our gazes locked, mine brimming with confusion, his with a kind of weary compassion. In that suspended moment, words spilled from my own lips, unbidden. I told myself about the fear that if I ever stopped driving, the world would unravel, about the sense that someone needed to witness the final journey, even if it was my own. I admitted my terror of dying alone on a forgotten road, of leaving nothing behind but an unclaimed hearse and a list of names fading from memory. The other me nodded, his eyes reflecting my own doubts, and then he said something I would never forget. "You cannot carry the dead forever. Sooner or later you have to let yourself be carried." The line echoed impossibly inside my chest as the windows rolled up, mine first, then his. The cars diverged slightly, the spell broken but not forgotten. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the other hearse vanish into mist, but it lingered, tail lights glowing like embers, until a bend in the road swallowed them whole. From that night on, every encounter left behind echoes of conversation, snatches of dialogue I could not quite recall but could never fully forget. Sometimes I would catch myself whispering answers to the empty seat beside me, or hear my own voice layered over the radio's static, repeating warnings and regrets. The distance between the two drivers, the two selves, grew ever more porous, as if the road was trying to fuse us into one, to force me to accept the truth of what I was seeing, that I was both the mourner and the mourned, the driver and the driven, forever circling the edge of my own last story. But even as I tried to understand, the cycle continued, each repetition dragging me closer to the end, and to the terrifying possibility that on the final night, the conversation might not end with words, but with a collision neither of us could avoid. The next encounter was not like the others. By then my nerves were frayed, each mile along the rural stretch taut as a violin string, expectation thickening with every dip in the road and every glance in the mirror. I felt myself eroding, becoming less a man than a routine, a pattern etched into the asphalt by repetition and dread. Still, something new crept into the ritual that seventh night, a sensation of being watched from within my own vehicle, a shifting weight in the air, a coldness that pressed into my back and seeped up from the floorboards. I was not alone, not in the literal sense of headlights behind or before, but in the subtle rearrangement of the world inside the car itself. The other hearse arrived as always, emerging out of the fog as if from the negative of a photograph. But this time I was prepared, the window already half down, breath fogging in the chill. We matched pace, tires thrumming in harmony, and once more my reflection stared back, gaunt and searching. But something was different in the glass, a distortion, a warping of the scene behind my doppelganger's shoulder. The back seat of his car, usually a dark and empty shadow, now cradled a blurred form, a smudge of darkness hunched where the dead would ride. I stared, feeling the cold gnaw at the nape of my neck, every instinct urging me to look away, to keep my eyes fixed on the road, but I couldn't. The other me glanced at the rearview mirror, and in that sliver of movement I saw, mirrored behind him, the outline of a figure slumped against the window. The details wouldn't resolve. A face obscured by hair, hands pressed flat to the glass, breath blooming frost across the pane. The features, when they came into focus, seemed wrong, shifting, faceless, at once a stranger and someone heartbreakingly familiar. My own hearse grew heavier, as if the unseen passenger had crossed the threshold between our two realities and now rode behind me, watching, waiting. The seatbelt clicked by itself, the upholstery creaked, and the rear view began to darken, a cloudy imprint of a head and shoulders rising up in the reflection. My knuckles went white on the wheel, sweat freezing at the base of my spine as I realized the other car was not just my reflection. It was a warning, and a memory, and a promise all at once. It was a hearse that carried more than the dead. It carried the forgotten, the unfinished, those who never reached their destination. In a moment of panic, I fumbled with the radio, seeking any noise to break the spell, but all that spilled out was a static-laced waltz, slow and sorrowful, and beneath the music, a voice, my own, and not my own, whispered a name I'd never spoken but instantly knew. It was the name of the one I could not save, the one whose funeral I had never finished, the one who haunted my waking hours and my dreams. The shape in the back seat pressed closer, the fog on the window thickening until I could almost make out lips moving, repeating a question I'd buried for years. Will you take me home this time? The realization hit like a blow. The cycle would not end until I faced this hidden passenger, until I accepted the weight of what I had left undone, the promises unkept, the lives I could not deliver to rest. Every repetition, every ghostly twin, every mirrored journey had led me here, to the truth that the road was not simply a loop, but a spiral tightening around the absence in the back seat, the shadow I carried through every funeral, every sleepless night. When I dared look back just for a second, the seat behind me was empty. The chill retreated, the heaviness lightened, but I knew better than to believe it was over. I drove the rest of the route in silence, the other hearse fading in the rear view, the memory of the hidden passenger lingering like a question that had yet to be answered. The following days, I wandered through my own life like a somnambulist, feeling as if I was only half anchored to the world of the living. Every time I closed my eyes, the image returned. The blurred passenger in the back seat, the face that could never quite come into focus, the name whispered through static and fog. I stopped telling anyone at work about the encounters. Who would believe me now when I barely believed myself? But the rituals became more desperate, more elaborate. I drove with the interior lights on, checked the mirrors compulsively, and sometimes, as the sky bled into dawn, I would find myself parked at the shoulder of the old rural road with no memory of how I'd gotten there. And always the sense that I was missing something, some truth just out of reach, some unspoken debt that was slowly collecting interest with every circuit. Haunted by the hidden passenger, I found myself returning again and again to the story's beginning, combing through funeral records, accident reports, and faded newspaper clippings at the funeral home. There was a logic to the cycle, I was sure of it, a pattern that ran deeper than repetition and mirrored headlights. I pored over archives late into the night, the overhead fluorescents buzzing and flickering, as if the building itself was growing uneasy. In a battered filing cabinet labeled Incidents, I discovered the records of old funeral routes, deliveries that never reached their destination, tales half told by grizzled drivers who'd quit suddenly or gone missing without warning. One file, water-stained and torn at the edges, stood out. William Avery, Route 19, 1974. The notes were terse. Didn't return. Car found empty, engine cold, key still in ignition, no sign of William. Family never claimed the body. Funerary documents incomplete. My heart hammered. I dug deeper. There were others. James Rowe, 1989, vanished on a foggy night. Alan Beckett, 2002, never made it to the church. His hearse discovered days later, doors locked from the inside. In every case, the same oddities appeared. Unexplained lapses in time. Reports of seeing themselves on the road. Cargo gone missing or unclaimed. The pattern, once seen, could not be unseen. There were too many names. Too many empty vehicles recovered on the same stretch of rural highway, each one like an echo of my own journey. It became clear that the road itself was not simply haunted by a single ghost, but by the accumulation of every journey interrupted, every funeral left incomplete, every passenger denied their final destination. The cycle was a palimpsest, layered over generations, each new driver inheriting the burdens of those who came before. It was as if the grief and unfinished business of the dead had pooled along the asphalt, forming a snare that waited for any soul unlucky or guilty enough to stumble into its grasp. On my next drive, as dusk crept across the fields, I tried to approach the journey differently. Instead of fighting the repetition, I surrendered to it, letting the routine carry me forward like a leaf on a current. When the other hearse appeared, I didn't tense up or look away. I watched closely. This time, as our cars drew parallel, I raised a hand in greeting, not in challenge or fear, but in recognition. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in the other car, my twin, gaunt, hollow-eyed but calm, nodded back. This night, when the apparition pulled ahead and turned off onto a side road, I followed. The air grew thick with static. The headlights flickered. The side road wound through thick woods, branches arching overhead like the ribs of a cathedral. At the end, the path opened onto a small abandoned graveyard, one I'd never seen marked on any map, the headstones half buried and scrawled with names that matched those from the missing driver's files. My hands shook as I stepped from the hearse. In the moonlight, the other me, now outside his vehicle, stood waiting beside a grave that had no date, only the word home etched crudely on the stone. The shadowy passenger emerged behind him, face still hidden, and for a moment all three of us stood together on the edge of the grave. I understood then that the cycle demanded closure, demanded that someone bear witness and perform the final rites for those left behind, the unfinished funerals, the lost souls, the drivers who disappeared. None could rest until someone acknowledged their stories, carried them not just in cargo, but in memory. My presence, my willingness to follow was enough to crack the ritual's surface. With shaking hands I recited a prayer, simple, clumsy, but heartfelt. I spoke aloud the names I'd found in the files, apologizing for every journey that ended too soon, every promise broken by fear or accident or forgetfulness. The shadowy passenger seemed to grow lighter, their outline less threatening, more mournful. The other me, the twin bound to the cycle, offered a faint, grateful smile. As dawn approached, the graveyard faded. The cars, the road, even the woods themselves shimmered, blurred by tears and exhaustion. I awoke slumped over the wheel, the sky pale, my hands cold, but empty of dread. The rural road was behind me, no other hearse in sight, and in the back seat there was only the gentle, unremarkable silence of an ordinary morning. Yet I knew the story wasn't finished. The cycle might loosen, but it would never truly break. Others would travel the road. Others would carry the same weight, searching for closure on routes that looped between the living and the dead. But for now, I had named the passenger. I had faced the hidden truths. The dread that had once haunted me became something quieter, an ache perhaps, but no longer a curse. Back at the funeral home, I filed my notes away, scrawling the names one last time in the battered incident ledger. The record would outlast me, a breadcrumb trail for the next soul trapped in the looping miles. And sometimes late at night, I'd sit in the hearse with the engine off, listening to the silence, knowing that I'd become both driver and witness, carrier and cargo, on a road where every ending was simply another beginning waiting in the fog. It happened inevitably, on a night so quiet it felt like the entire world had gone dormant. The air was thick with that heavy rural darkness that swallows even the sound of your own breath, and the sky above was scraped raw by a crescent moon. I had begun to sense the approach of the 10th journey all day, a kind of tension in my muscles, as if every step and gesture was guided by someone else's invisible hand. I performed my routines in a fugue, collecting the keys from the office, checking the tires, cleaning the inside of the hearse with a care I'd never shown before. The staff at the funeral home didn't look at me strangely anymore. By now they must have recognized the faraway expression, the stiffness of someone traveling a road that no map would claim. When I turned the ignition that night, a familiar dread filled the car, yet it was almost peaceful, like the calm before a storm that you've braced for so many times you've forgotten what it's like to not expect it. I let the radio play whatever song it wanted, not trying to drown out the noise or summon comfort. The cargo was anonymous, a name on a card, a face I would never know. But as I steered onto the rural highway, the headlights seemed to reach farther into the night than usual, illuminating fields glazed with dew and the long wavering shadow of the car behind me. The first sign came at the fork in the road, a shiver down my spine, a flicker of movement in the side mirror. I didn't flinch or slow down. I simply took the turn I always took, the shortcut I'd promised myself never to take again, the one the GPS seemed to favor, always resetting the route in subtle defiance of my wishes. And just beyond the rise, on that stretch lined with the pale trunks of ancient birches, I saw them, the other hearse, a mirror image in the gloom, rolling toward me without sound, its beams merging with mine in a single corridor of light. Both cars slowed and stopped, facing each other in the middle of the empty road. I let the engine idle, felt my pulse climb in my throat. Across the gap, the other driver sat motionless, hands resting on the wheel, head bowed as if in silent prayer. Our windows aligned, and for the first time, there was no fog on the glass, no distortion, just the clear, unyielding gaze of my own eyes staring back. It was as if every version of myself that had ever driven this road was distilled in that moment, every choice and failure, every regret. We stepped out together, doors creaking in unison. The air between us was charged, thick with the static of 1,000 words unsaid. For a long minute we simply stood, staring at one another, until the silence itself seemed to press down with unbearable weight. I looked down, half expecting to see the ground open beneath me, to feel the chill of the grave at my feet. Instead, I saw only the familiar blacktop, marked with tire tracks, with footprints that seemed to multiply and diverge, crisscrossing through time. Then, almost without thinking, we spoke, the same words, the same breath. "Are you ready?" The question echoed in the night, not a challenge but an invitation. I realized then that this encounter was not about fear or punishment or even closure. It was about acknowledgement, about facing the self that had always been running, the part of me that carried every lost passenger, every unfinished funeral, every burden and sorrow I had never truly set down. I felt the weight of the hidden passenger, the faceless shadow who had haunted my dreams and my rear-view mirror, pressing against me. It was a weight that was not simply mine, but shared among all the drivers who had become lost in these looping roads, all the mourners and the mourned who had never been granted the comfort of rest. It was the accumulation of unfinished stories, of grief that refused to dissipate, of memory made manifest in steel and asphalt. I stepped forward. My other self did the same. For a moment, we met in the beam of the headlights, our shadows tangled and indistinguishable on the ground. I reached out and, without words, placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the cold solidity of it. He smiled, a weary, broken smile that I recognized from every sleepless night, every moment spent staring into the dark, hoping for relief. There were tears on both our faces, and in that instant, I felt the burden shift, not lifted, but finally seen and acknowledged. I whispered the names I had collected, the names from the files and from the whispering static, the names of the drivers who never came home, and the passengers who waited for a journey's end that never arrived. The air changed, lightened, as if the road itself had exhaled after holding its breath for a century. The other driver nodded. We turned back to our cars, engines humming in the night, and without fanfare, we drove in opposite directions. For the first time, the road did not loop back on itself. The intersection stayed behind me, swallowed by the distance and the slow approach of morning. The sense of being watched faded, replaced by an unfamiliar emptiness, the emptiness of freedom, of a burden set down, even if only for a while. At the next crossroad, I paused, looking in the mirror. No other car followed. The back seat was empty. The world outside was the world I remembered, no longer warped by ritual or memory. And as I drove back to the city, the first pink glow of dawn rising behind the silos and water towers, I allowed myself a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Back in the garage, I sat for a long time with the engine off, the silence a benediction. No one greeted me or asked about the trip. The office was still, the files at rest. I felt tired, not the bone-deep exhaustion of a soul trapped in a cycle, but the simple tiredness of a long journey finished, a job completed with honor. For the first time, I understood that the road's power came not from the dead, but from the living, those of us who can choose at last to say goodbye. It's strange how quickly the world returns to normal when a haunting ends, not with thunder or spectacle, but with a sigh and a slow drift back toward light. After that final journey, something subtle in me shifted. A thread quietly snipped. I felt lighter, but also older, as though I'd inherited the weight of every story I'd gathered, and then at last been permitted to set it down. For weeks, my life returned to its routines. I drove the hearse to small country cemeteries and bustling city lots. The GPS behaved, the radio played only static and pop songs, the rear view was mercifully empty, save for the usual shadow of the headrest. I found myself savoring the ordinary, the slow pour of coffee in the break room, the idle talk of co-workers, the uncomplicated silence of a car in the morning. I didn't mention the encounters to anyone, though now and then I'd catch another driver glancing at me, as if searching for a mark or secret sign. I only smiled, and in their eyes saw the same relief, the same muted gratitude. But of course, peace in this line of work is always provisional. I still had the battered incident ledger, thick with names and dates, tucked into a drawer beneath my gloves. Sometimes I'd run my thumb along the worn spine, recalling the faces and voices from the loop. The dreams grew softer, not the hard, cold replay of the looping road and the face in the opposite hearse, but the gentle, fleeting sense of farewells said and journeys completed. There were still funerals that twisted my gut, stories that haunted the back seat. But the pressure had changed. Grief was no longer a chain, only a stone in the pocket, weighty but not unbearable. Every so often, on a moonless night, I'd take a back road home, curiosity tickling the back of my mind. The urge to test the boundary returned. Would I see the other me, the twin who drove in circles and never arrived? But the road was always empty, the way clear, the world at peace. I wondered if I would ever encounter another driver caught in the loop, or if by breaking the pattern, I had set something right, not just for myself, but for everyone who had ever gotten lost out there, headlights locked in a silent standoff with themselves. Then one evening, as I parked outside a distant chapel, a junior driver approached me, pale and unsettled. He spoke of strange dreams, of seeing his own car ahead of him on the highway, of feeling watched. I recognized the symptoms immediately, the frayed nerves and haunted eyes. Gently, I asked about his routes, his passengers, the sense of unfinished business he couldn't explain. He nodded, voice low, and I told him the story. Not all of it, but enough. I told him to remember the names, to offer the simplest gesture of respect, to refuse the urge to run, that it's the acknowledgement, the naming, the witnessing that frees us, not denial, not flight. I watched the relief spread through his face, watched him square his shoulders and walk back to his hearse with a little more confidence. In that moment, I understood the true legacy of the road. The cycle is never truly broken. It's only passed along, each of us setting down the weight for the next to pick up, a tradition of memory and mourning and small redemptive acts. As I drove home that night, the final remnants of fear faded like mist under the rising sun. I was no longer trapped in that endless confrontation, no longer circling a rural dead end with ghosts in my rear view. The world had grown larger, the road longer, the journey uncertain, but I was at peace with all of it, at last. When I closed my eyes, I saw not the looping highway or the duplicate car, but the faces of those I had carried, the burdens I had lifted, the small graces exchanged between the living and the dead. And when, on some future night, my own journey finally ends, I hope another driver will greet me at the crossroads, not as a rival, not as a warning, but as a friend offering a hand and a final goodbye. The truth is, we're all both passengers and drivers here, forever seeking rest, forever learning how to let go.